I never dared to call it love, not because I wasn't sure, but because he never once named it. There were no whispered confessions under moonlight, no desperate declarations between deadlines, just the silence between us, thick, charged, and dangerously easy to misread. In a world where everything needed to be defined, labeled, clarified, he preferred shadows, and I lived in them willingly, because even borrowed warmth felt like survival. James had that kind of presence, the type that made a room curve slightly in his direction. He was older than me by a few years, already established, already admired, a senior architect with sleeves rolled up and a voice like low jazz. People respected him, but they also liked him, and that made him dangerous in a way I didn't see at first. I was the new guy, Evan. Quiet, efficient. I didn't dress loud, didn't network loud, didn't live loud. But I designed like I meant it, the kind of blueprints that earned raised eyebrows and reluctant nods. I was still finding my rhythm at the firm when James first asked me to stay late to revise a client model. Just you and me, he said, tossing it off casually, like it meant nothing. But the way his eyes lingered made me wonder. Nights like that became a rhythm of their own. We'd sit shoulder to shoulder, debating angles, sharing playlists, laughing at each other's terrible coffee habits. Sometimes he'd bring in takeout. Other times he'd walk me to my car, his hand brushing my back too long to be purely professional. I convinced myself I wasn't imagining it. How could I be when he remembered the exact album I played the first time we worked late together, when he'd text at midnight just to share a song that felt like something you'd like? When he looked at me, not like a colleague, but like someone he noticed, in a world that always told me to tone it down, to blend in, to be useful, not visible. He never said the words, but he didn't stop me from hoping. We never kissed. Not really. Just a too long glance in a hotel lobby during a conference in Chicago. A shared room with two beds pushed far apart, but a silence in the middle that felt louder than any moan. He stood too close when he didn't have to, laughed too softly at things that weren't funny, and I let myself believe. Because when you've spent most of your life loving in silence, the smallest echo feels like a song. So I stayed. I gave more than I was asked. Picked up extra work when he was swamped, covered for him when he forgot deadlines, listened when he vented about pressure from above. I became indispensable, not to the firm, but to him. The kind of emotional scaffolding men like him lean on but never thank. And then one day he started pulling away. It was subtle at first, a missed text, a shorter meeting, a colder reply. Then came the announcement. James had been nominated for regional design director. It was a huge jump. Everyone celebrated, except me, because that week I stumbled across the internal presentation he submitted to the board. In the diversity inclusion section, there it was in sharp Helvetica, as a gay man who has led diverse creative teams. My name wasn't there, but I was in it. I stared at the words so long they stopped making sense. This was the same man who had never once said he was gay, who joked about the HR rainbow emails like they were a joke, who shut down any office rumors by changing the subject, who once told me in a whisper, "I just don't think labels help anyone." But now, when it meant prestige, leverage, a promotion, suddenly he had a label and I was his unspoken proof. I didn't say anything, not to James, not to anyone. What do you even say to a man who used your silence as proof of his identity? For days, I kept rereading that report, those few lines, that perfect corporate phrasing. As a gay man, I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it sounded so clean, so tidy, like he'd packaged his truth into a bullet point and filed it next to company values, except it wasn't his truth. It was mine, and he never asked. He never even looked back. The distance between us grew faster after that. No more late nights, no more shared playlists. When I'd pass him in the hallway, he'd smile like we were old classmates, not like we'd once stayed up talking about childhood memories over cheap wine. His eyes didn't linger anymore. His text stopped coming. He moved up and I stayed behind, suspended in a space I didn't know how to explain. People started asking if I was okay. I'd say I was tired. Deadlines, allergies, anything but the truth. Because how do you explain grief for something that never had a name? I started doubting myself. Had I misread everything? Was I the one who filled the silence with meaning? Maybe the playlist didn't mean anything. Maybe the hotel glance was nothing. Maybe I'd projected every gentle touch, every long look, every soft pause between us. Maybe I'd been nothing but convenient. And still, I couldn't be angry, not out loud, because he hadn't promised me anything, right? He never said he loved me, never kissed me, never wrote it down. But that's the thing about unspoken love. It makes the heartbreak quieter, but deeper, like a bruise no one sees. One night, I found myself scrolling through our old messages. They weren't romantic, not overtly, but they were full of warmth, inside jokes, tiny check-ins, emojis that lingered too long. I remembered how they used to make my chest ache with a strange, hopeful sweetness. Now they felt like evidence, not of love, but of my foolishness. There was one message, months back, where he'd sent me a photo of a street musician in Paris playing our favorite song. Reminded me of you, he'd said. And I had replied, maybe one day we'll go together. He never answered that one. I closed my laptop. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing his voice in my head from a workshop he led once. He was speaking to the newer staff, giving his usual polished speech about creative freedom and workplace equity, but at one point his tone shifted. Softer, real. There's someone who's been by my side throughout this journey, he said, almost like a confession. He's not in this room, but he shaped who I've become in more ways than he'll ever know. People had clapped, smiled, thought it was sweet, but I knew he was talking about me. And for a moment I felt seen, but now it felt like theft. Like he had taken the most private, vulnerable part of my life and turned it into a stepping stone, not out of malice, but out of entitlement. As if, because I never asked for credit, he could cash in on my silence. I didn't plan revenge, not the kind you'd see in movies anyway. No confrontation in the office kitchen, no dramatic email blast, no screaming match in the parking garage. Just a quiet unraveling. Inside, I was breaking down in layers, like one of those architectural models I used to build. Beautiful on the outside, but hollow when you lift the roof. I stopped volunteering for extra projects, started missing internal socials. My lines in meetings grew clipped. My designs lost their edge. No one said anything, but I could feel the shift. Subtle, like pity dressed up as politeness. I stopped listening to music. For weeks, even silence had become too loud. There was this one evening, I remember it vividly, rain tapping against the windows of my apartment. I was sitting on the floor, surrounded by crumpled sketch papers, and my phone buzzed. A company-wide email. Regional Director James Miller to speak at Pride Leadership Summit, sharing his journey as a trailblazing LGBTQ+ executive. I stared at it, then laughed, a real laugh, sharp, bitter, unfamiliar. I think something inside me broke in that moment, not because he was going, but because I knew I wasn't invited, not just to the event, but to the story, our story. He had stolen the intimacy and made it strategy. He had turned what we never said into something he could say in front of strangers, under rainbow banners and applause. He'd taken the part of me that I had protected like glass and repackaged it as inspiration. I opened my work email, scrolled back through months of messages, found the ones where he thanked me for my loyalty, for being his anchor, the midnight photos from airports, the shared song links, his little notes in project files that only I would understand. Then I remembered the workshop recording, the one where he talked about me without saying my name. It was saved in the internal training archive. I downloaded it. I listened again, this time not as someone in love, but as someone gathering pieces of a story that had never been theirs to write. The next day, I attached the audio file in a private message to the company's ethics integrity department, along with screenshots, a timeline, nothing dramatic, no accusations, just context. And at the end of the message, I typed one sentence: you can't build equity on stolen truth. I didn't sign it emotionally, didn't add my pain. I didn't want revenge. I wanted the record to be clear. Sometimes silence needs a witness too. No one replied to my message, at least not directly. But a few weeks later, the Pride Summit listing quietly changed. James was still speaking, but the blurb lost the words trailblazing and his journey. The language grew corporate again, hollow, safe. Inside the firm, the mood around him shifted. People still smiled, but not as freely. The ones who once quoted his jokes in meetings began choosing other voices to echo. He looked tired. I didn't feel triumphant, just free. 2 weeks after that, I submitted my resignation. No dramatic reason, just seeking new opportunities. They offered me a raise, a title change. Even James left a handwritten note on my desk, wishing you the best, always. I didn't keep it. On my last day, I stood by the lobby window, watching the city breathe beneath me. I thought of all the moments I had shrunk myself, all the words I hadn't said, all the parts of me I had folded away to make someone else feel more comfortable in their skin. And I realized I didn't want to be the silent foundation of anyone else's story anymore. I bought a one-way ticket out west, packed light, started writing again, essays, fragments, little vignettes of things I had once lived but never processed. I traveled, met people, not looking, just open. There was a man I met in Santa Fe. Nothing happened. Just a shared coffee and a conversation about mid-century design and old books. But for the first time, I didn't feel like I needed to impress, to offer more than myself. I was just Evan, and that was enough. Sometimes I still think about James. Not with anger, not even with longing, just with the quiet clarity of someone who finally sees the full shape of what used to be shadows. He taught me something in his own selfish way. He taught me what love isn't, and now I know what it should be. I don't need apologies. I don't need closure. I just need to remember, always, love isn't meant to be displayed. It's meant to protect. Healing doesn't come in waves. It comes in fragments. Some days, it's as loud as laughter with strangers on a trail you've never walked before. Other days, it's the soft realization that you went an entire morning without thinking of someone who used to own your every thought. For me, it began in a sun-bleached cafe in Sedona. I had been traveling for 6 weeks. No schedule, no expectations. Just me, a worn leather journal, and a quiet vow to live in the present, no matter how uncertain it felt. That day, I was sketching a doorway I'd passed earlier. Intricate, Spanish style, cracked with age, but somehow still proud. As I shaded the curve of the arch, I heard someone sit down across from me. "Your lines are sharp," a voice said, "but you're holding your pencil too tight." I looked up. He was maybe mid-30s, bookish in a denim button-up, sunglasses pushed into messy hair. There was a calmness in him, an ease I hadn't seen in a long time. "Architect?" he asked. I nodded, unsure why I didn't feel the usual instinct to deflect. "Me too, retired," he smiled. "At 36, can you believe that?" I laughed. For the first time in weeks, it wasn't bitter. His name was Micah. He had worked in restoration, old buildings, forgotten spaces. "Nothing shiny," he said. "Just the stories people stopped telling." Over the next hour, we talked about sandstone, symmetry, cities we loved. Not once did he ask why I was here. Not once did he press. When I stood up to leave, he handed me a napkin with a bookstore name scrawled on it. "If you want to talk more about broken things made whole," he said, "that's where I'll be on Sundays." I didn't go that week, but I thought about it. A few days later, I was hiking a cliff path when my phone buzzed. It was an old colleague, Tasha, someone I trusted. "You're not going to believe this," she wrote. "They're investigating James, internal ethics, something about manipulation, identity exploitation." Quiet but serious, I stopped walking. The wind cut harder at that altitude, but it wasn't what chilled me. I hadn't expected fallout. I thought the company would bury it, move on, maybe he'd get a slap on the wrist or nothing at all, but now the truth was echoing louder than I ever intended. I didn't feel satisfied. I felt conflicted. Was this justice or cruelty? A part of me wanted to call him, not to reconcile, but to understand what he told himself each night. But I didn't, because part of healing is learning not to knock on doors that hurt you every time they open. I didn't go to the bookstore the following Sunday, but I did on the next. It was small, the kind of place that smelled like dust and second chances. Sunlight streamed through arched windows, landing on worn leather chairs and overstuffed shelves. There was a cat, too, sleeping unapologetically on top of a display titled Architecture of Emotion, and Micah was there. He didn't look surprised to see me, just nodded toward the seat across from him. We didn't talk about James, not that day, not the next, but he knew, maybe not the details, but the shape of it. The way someone does when they've also been used as someone else's ladder. Over time, I learned that Micah had left his career after a very public fallout with a high-profile client who tried to erase the input of junior architects from a major city restoration project. They wanted the look of collaboration, he said, without the inconvenience of giving credit. We were both in some way ghosts of other people's ambitions. But sitting across from him, I didn't feel invisible. He had a way of listening without leaning in, of letting silences settle without needing to fill them. We shared books, quiet walks, coffee that turned into late afternoon wine. Not dates, not yet, just presence. One evening, as we sat on a rooftop watching the desert light fold into lavender shadows, he turned to me and asked, "Do you miss it?" I didn't need to ask what it meant. I missed the idea of it, I said. Of what it could have been, he nodded. But not him. I paused. Thought of James's voice, the half smiles, the playlist songs I couldn't bear to hear anymore. No, I said finally, not him, just the part of me I used to give so easily. That part's still there, Micah said softly. It's just smarter now. Something in me exhaled. That night I didn't kiss him, but for the first time in a long time, I wanted to be known again. 2 weeks later, I received an email. Not from the company, not from Tasha. From him. Subject, coffee, just that, a single word. No greeting, no explanation, just a timestamp and a location. Tuesday, 4 p.m., the little cafe near our old office where we used to order cold brews with cinnamon. For a long time, I stared at the screen. The invitation wasn't framed in apology. It wasn't even a question. It was an echo, as if no time had passed. As if the last message he ever sent me hadn't been months ago, a generic "take care." I didn't reply, but I went. Not because I owed him anything, but because part of me needed to look him in the eye and see the truth, not the version I had built in the quiet. He was already there when I arrived. Same blazer, same polished posture, same calculated calm, but his eyes, they looked tired. Not just from work, from wait. We ordered the same drinks. When he spoke, his voice was softer. "You look good." I didn't answer. He tried again. "I heard you've been traveling." "Some," I said. Silence. Then, "They put me on administrative leave." Not publicly, but it's happening. I looked out the window. "Because of the file?" He nodded, then paused. "You sent it?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. He looked down at his coffee. Stirred it. "You know I didn't mean to hurt you." "No," I said quietly. "You meant to protect yourself." Another pause. "You were important to me, Evan." I smiled, not kindly. "Important enough to build a lie around," I said. He didn't argue. I didn't know how to be open, not at work. Not then. "But you knew how to use it," I said. "You used me." His hands tightened around the cup. I panicked. "I was told to add something about diversity. They wanted representation. And you thought, perfect, I've got Evan." "It wasn't like that." "It was exactly like that," I said, voice still low. "You didn't out me, but you used my silence to paint yourself more progressive. You borrowed a part of me I hadn't even found the words for yet. And you never asked." He didn't speak. People passed by the window. Life went on. I stood. "I'm not here to forgive you," I said, "but I am done carrying you around like a phantom." He opened his mouth to say something, but I was already walking away. The wind hit as I stepped outside, sharp and bright and strangely clean. I didn't look back. I didn't cry after leaving that cafe. I didn't feel victorious either, just empty in a clean sort of way, like a room finally cleared of someone else's belongings. There's sadness in that kind of space, but there's also clarity. You can breathe again. You can paint the walls any color you want. I went back to the bookstore that weekend. Micah was there. He didn't ask how the meeting went, just passed me a cup of tea and handed me a novel I hadn't read before. We sat there quietly, the kind of quiet that doesn't demand anything of you. Later that evening, he walked me home. Outside my door, he paused. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "But if you ever want to build something new, not immediately, not perfectly, I'd like to be there." I didn't answer right away. I looked up at the sky, at the unfamiliar stars, and realized I wasn't trying to fill a hole anymore. I was planting something. Slowly, gently, honestly. I turned back to him and said, "Let's not build over ruins." He smiled. "We won't." That night, I pulled out my sketchbook. For the first time in months, I didn't draw buildings. I drew light, space, openings, and in the bottom corner of the page, in a barely there line, I wrote, "This time, the truth is mine." There's a certain stillness in healing no one talks about, not the dramatic turning points, not the cinematic breakdowns, just the quiet mornings when your breath doesn't hitch while pouring coffee, when a familiar street no longer burns with memory, when you wake up and realize you didn't dream about them last night. That's where I was. Micah and I didn't rush. We didn't call it anything. There were no declarations, no labels, just shared silence, long walks, and slow familiarity. We talked about books and cities and the music that got us through old heartbreaks. Some nights we'd stay in, just sketching across from each other, each lost in our own world but anchored by presence. And then, without warning, the past knocked again. It started with a voicemail. "Hey, Evan, this is Clara from HR. Sorry to reach out so unexpectedly. There's something you may want to know regarding the final ethics findings. No obligation to respond, but if you're open, I'd appreciate 5 minutes of your time." I let the message sit for a day. Micah noticed my shift immediately. "Want to talk about it?" I shook my head. But later that night, I did. "He's not part of my life anymore," I said, but somehow his shadow keeps showing up. Micah didn't interrupt. Didn't try to fix it. He just asked, "Do you think you need closure or just control over how it ends?" I didn't have an answer. But the next morning, I called Clara back. She was professional, but her tone was warmer than I remembered. "I just wanted to let you know, James has formally resigned. The ethics committee concluded there was misrepresentation, especially in how he framed certain relationships. It won't be made public, but the board issued an internal policy revision because of your case." I was silent. Clara added, "No action is expected from you. We just thought you should know." I thanked her. Before she hung up, she said, "You didn't just make space for yourself, Evan. You cleared space for others who've been overlooked in silence. You should be proud of that." The call ended. I sat there, phone still in hand, wondering why I didn't feel lighter. Maybe closure wasn't about getting the right ending. Maybe it was about being okay when the ending never quite balances out. The letter arrived 3 days later. No return address, just my name, written in that familiar handwriting I used to study during late nights at the office. Precise, measured, like everything he ever did. I didn't open it at first. I placed it on the kitchen counter, made tea, stared out the window, but it sat there, breathing. Not like paper, but like presence. When I finally opened it, the first line stopped me cold. "I won't ask for forgiveness because I don't deserve it." The handwriting slanted slightly on that line, as if the weight of it had finally cracked through the practiced composure. He went on, "I don't know how to explain what I did without it sounding like justification. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was hunger, not for love, but for validation. I saw the way people looked at you, Evan, the quiet brilliance, the trust. And I envied that. I didn't know how to be that person. So instead of standing beside you, I tried to stand on you." There was a pause in the writing, a section scratched out, then rewritten more slowly. I told myself it wasn't exploitation. I convinced myself that if I never touched you, never kissed you, then I wasn't really crossing any line. But we both know that's a lie. What I did was worse than touching. I borrowed your truth and wore it like a badge. Not because I loved you, but because I knew you loved me. I had to stop reading. The tears didn't come the way I expected. They weren't hot or sharp. They were slow, cold, like the kind that come after a wound has stopped bleeding but still hasn't healed. I picked the letter back up. I remember every night we stayed late. The playlists, the coffee, the way you looked at me when you thought I wasn't watching. And I remember the moment I decided to trade all of that for a line in a report. I thought I'd never have to answer for it, that you'd stay silent, like always. But you didn't. You said everything without shouting. You reminded me that some truths fight their way to light whether we name them or not. The last line was scrawled more than written. "I hope one day someone loves you with the courage I never had." I folded the letter, hands shaking. It wasn't an apology, it was a confession. And in a strange, twisted way, it was the most honest thing he had ever given me. Micah found me an hour later, sitting on the porch, the letter still in my lap. He didn't ask what it said. He just sat beside me, shoulders touching, until the sky turned gold. I didn't speak until dusk. Do you believe people change? I asked. Micah thought for a moment. I believe people learn, he said, some too late, others just in time. I nodded. Then I whispered, more to myself than to him. He loved me with fear. But next time, I want to be loved with bravery. Micah didn't press. He never did. But the next morning, he left something on my doorstep. Not flowers, not a letter. Just a small hardcover book, Structures of Belonging. Inside the cover, a single note in his handwriting, when you're ready to build something with a name. I held it for a long time because this wasn't James. This wasn't vague. This wasn't conditional or borrowed or whispered in hallways. This was deliberate, real, honest, and terrifying. I'd gotten used to love that lived in shadows, so when someone brought it out into the sun, I didn't know where to stand. But I went to him that evening anyway. Micah opened the door like he'd been expecting me, no questions. No, what changed your mind? Just 2 mugs of tea already brewing and a playlist that didn't include a single song from my past. That night, we sat on the floor again, sketching, sipping, smiling. I looked at him across the table, pencil in hand, and said, I'm scared. He didn't flinch. Good, he replied. That means it matters. We didn't define anything that night, but I reached for his hand, not hesitantly, not halfway. And he met me there, steady and warm. There were no more borrowed truths between us, only chosen ones. Weeks passed. Micah and I moved at our own pace. We weren't perfect. Some days I still flinched when the past tried to crawl back in. But each time, he stayed, not to fix me, but to remind me I wasn't alone in the rebuilding. One morning, I submitted a short essay to an independent queer magazine. My story told in my words with no names, just emotion and blueprints and one quiet rebellion. They published it, emails poured in from strangers, from survivors, from architects who had felt invisible in their own buildings. One message stood out. It was from a young intern at my old firm. I'm out now. Your story helped me find the courage. Thank you for being louder than they expected. I smiled, not because I needed validation, but because I had become the version of myself I once searched for in others. Now, when I look at Micah across a dinner table or hear him hum while watering the plants, I don't brace for the moment it might vanish. Because this is a love with walls and windows, one that doesn't hide, one that lets the light in. Healing teaches you strange things. Like how silence can be warm when it's chosen, how trust isn't loud, how love, when real, isn't meant to save you, just stand beside you while you save yourself. That was life with Micah, steady, unrushed, full of little rituals that made the world feel less chaotic. Saturday mornings at the flea market, Tuesday evenings reading side by side in the bookstore, sticky notes on the fridge with architectural puns that made us both groan. I was happy, not euphoric, not breathless, just steady. And then came the invitation. It arrived in a formal envelope, thick paper, embossed logo. The Equity and Design Symposium cordially invites Evan R. to be the keynote speaker at this year's event. Voice visibility, building inclusive futures. I read the card twice, then I laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was absurd. I had spent years in silence, years being someone's uncredited proof. And now they wanted my voice? I showed it to Micah that night. He read it, then handed it back to me without comment. You should go, he said. I raised an eyebrow. Really? Yes, he replied, but not for them. I looked at the invitation again. I don't know what I'd say. He smiled gently. That's the reason you should go. The auditorium was beautiful. Polished concrete floors, soft amber lights, rows of seats that curved like a shell around the stage, and yet my hands were shaking. It wasn't the fear of public speaking. I'd presented to clients, pitched to boards, defended designs that had been ripped apart by critics. This was different because this time I wasn't presenting someone else's vision, I was presenting mine. I stood backstage scanning the crowd as it slowly filled. Young architects, veterans, professors, students clutching notebooks with too many sticky notes. Somewhere in that sea of faces, I knew someone would recognize parts of what I was about to say. Micah squeezed my hand before I stepped out. Don't teach, he said, just tell. And so I did. No slideshow, no notes. Just a single spotlight and my voice. I used to believe silence was safety, I began. The room stilled. I thought if I kept my love quiet, if I made myself small, if I gave without asking, I'd be safe, respected, protected. But here's the truth. Silence doesn't protect you. It buries you. I paused. In my early years as an architect, I fell in love. Not with a place, not with a building, with a person, a man. He was older, brilliant, admired, and very good at not naming things. A few murmurs. He never named what we had. Not out loud. And because I loved him, I let that silence define us. I worked late, covered for him, carried his weight. And when he was up for promotion, he submitted a statement claiming his identity as a gay man leading diverse teams. I let that hang in the air. We had never come out, not together, not even privately. He used my silence to validate his visibility, and I let him. I scanned the room. I didn't speak up to destroy him. I spoke up to reclaim myself, because you cannot build anything true on a stolen foundation. The applause came slowly. Not thunderous, but steady, certain. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't shaking anymore. After the session, people lined up to speak to me. Some just nodded. Others shared their own stories, hidden loves, professional betrayals, the delicate art of surviving uncredited. A young man with tears in his eyes said, I didn't know we could say those things. I smiled. We can, and we must. Later that evening, I found a message on my phone, unknown number, but the words were unmistakably his. I saw your speech. I hope you're proud. You should be. No apology. No explanation. Just a sentence that, for once, didn't try to take anything from me. I didn't reply. Not because I was angry, because there was nothing left to say. A week after the symposium, I received another offer. A publishing house, small, independent, but respected. They wanted to turn my speech into a short memoir, an essay collection, really. They said it could help others navigating professional erasure, identity politics, and the subtle violence of being included without being seen. I didn't answer right away. Mike and I drove out of town that weekend, into the mountains, away from signal and buzz and shoulds. We stayed in a cabin with creaky floors and thick quilts, surrounded by pine and stillness. I read the offer by firelight. Micah looked up from his book. You thinking about it? I nodded. I don't want to make a brand out of my pain. He smiled. Then don't make truth. The rest is noise. That night, wrapped in silence and old wood, I dreamed I was standing inside a house I hadn't drawn. It was unfamiliar. Open. Light spilled through every window, even the ones facing the past, and I wasn't hiding in it. I was home in it. Back in the city, I sent my reply. Yes, but only if I get to tell it without edits. They agreed. We called the book Borrowed Silence. In the foreword, I wrote, this is not a revenge story. This is a recovery. A voice, of visibility, of value. Of love that wasn't returned, but still made me real. Mike and I moved in together that spring. It wasn't dramatic. There were no big speeches, no ring boxes, no sunset ultimatums. Just shared laundry, extra mugs, toothbrushes, becoming roommates. And one morning, while drinking tea in the kitchen, he turned to me and said, do you realize you never flinch at your name anymore? I hadn't noticed, but he was right. Because for the first time in my life, when someone said Evan, I didn't hear who I was to someone else. I heard me. The award was unexpected. The New Voices and Design Committee had chosen my essay collection, Borrowed Silence, for their annual honor, citing its radical honesty and quiet power. Micah was more excited than I was. He even ironed a shirt for me, which was saying a lot. Are you nervous? He asked as we got dressed that evening. No, I said, then paused. Okay. Yes, but not about the speech. He didn't need to ask. He knew. Because when the organizers emailed me the guest list earlier that week, James's name was on it. I don't know why he was invited, maybe out of habit. Maybe someone thought it would be poetic. Maybe no one even realized the story in my book was about him, but I knew, and now he would too. The ceremony was held at a restored art museum, sleek, glassy, echoing. I stood backstage again, same butterflies, same breath control, but this time Micah was there with me, adjusting the crooked corner of my name tag. You don't owe anyone a perfect ending, he whispered. Only a real one. I stepped out to applause, not deafening, but warm. I accepted the plaque, smiled politely, and leaned into the mic. I'm not here because I wrote something clever, I began. I'm here because I finally told the truth. I didn't name names. I didn't linger on wounds. I spoke about what it means to be borrowed, in love, in work, in history, and what it takes to say, this story belongs to me now. As I finished, I caught a glimpse of him in the back row. James, older, a little more gray, a lot less sure. He didn't smile. He didn't flinch. He just watched. When the crowd stood to applaud, I didn't look for him again. After the ceremony, there was a reception, catered hors d'oeuvres, jazz trio in the corner, laughter clinking against champagne glasses. I made small talk, signed a few copies, accepted compliments I still didn't quite know how to hold. And then I saw him, James, standing alone near a sculpture, that same polished, composed look. But softer now, like he knew he didn't own the room anymore. Our eyes met. He nodded, I nodded back. Neither of us moved. There were no dramatic confrontations, no final speeches, no can we talk, because there was nothing left to unearth. Everything that needed to be said had already been carved into the pages of my book and into the life I was now living. Micah joined me, 2 glasses in hand. Was that him? He asked quietly. I didn't lie. Yes, he didn't say anything. He just offered me a glass and we clinked them gently. To stories that end where they're supposed to, I said, and new ones that don't start with shadows, he added. We left the museum shortly after. Outside, the night was cool. The streetlights made everything feel gentle. I took Micah's hand, not carefully, not like I was still learning how. Just naturally. We walked in silence, but not the kind that used to haunt me. This one was whole. Later that night, I sat down at my desk. I didn't open a sketch pad. I opened a blank document, typed 1 sentence. I was once loved in silence, but I refused to stay quiet forever. And then I wrote, this is not a love story. This is the story of becoming someone worthy of love, even when it wasn't offered the first time. I hit save, closed the laptop, and finally, I let the past be past.